Okay, welcome everyone to a podcast, Leading in Wyoming, where we feature Leadership Wyoming alumni from around the state. And today we have the absolute honor of being in an amazing place with an amazing person. So, Rosie Berger, welcome to Leading Wyoming.
Well, thank you, Mandy, very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's wonderful to be back home in the state capitol.
Yeah, tell me a little bit more about where we are sitting.
Well, we're sitting in a historical, territorial, house that was 1869, actually 1889, and it's been restored fully. In fact, this was a legislative service office that was blocked off. Just a portion of it, it was two-story, and we have now renovated it back to its original state. The historical significance is that we're just one of 20 state capitals in the nation that has this historic recognition. Mm-hmm. And we just opened it up this summer on July 10th, and really in a celebration of the 150th year of suffrage. And this is where Wyoming signed its constitution. And we've actually had this as a working Supreme Court just this fall. So, in fact, this to me is one of the bonuses of the restoration project.
Mm-hmm. It's really incredible. We'll do a little pan around so everyone can sort of see where we're sitting.
Yeah, when you look at the walls, they're all hand painted. Mm-hmm. And so when doing the restoration, we had the good fortune of the mistakes that were made in the 1970s and 80s to actually be able to peel back to the original colors. They were still here. And so we were able then to replicate that. And in fact, this entire room, the ceiling, etc., was replicated and put back together from out of state by some really amazing artisans. And here we are today with full light. In fact, when I served here in the legislature from 2003 to 2016, we had no windows halfway up in this room. So we didn't even know the treasure that we had before us.
Yeah, and some amazing stories that have taken place in this physical room. Mm-hmm. And there are also probably a lot of stories that we could talk about for you in your journey in this building and even in helping to restore this building over the last decade plus.
Right.
So maybe let's start at the beginning and we'll jump through a couple of different timelines. Sure. But you were a Leadership Wyoming graduate of 2002.
Yes.
And that then played a role in your decision to run for or serve in the House of Representatives.
Right. I mean, it was Leadership Wyoming influenced my entire legislative journey, really. It's where I built my relationships. It's where I became really connected with the state of Wyoming. And seriously, when I signed up and applied for Leadership Wyoming, it was not my intent to think about a political office. It was really just an extension of the volunteer work and the private business sector that I had been involved in. Really, a lot of time I spent on economic development and some areas like tourism, the film industry, a lot of different aspects of promoting Wyoming and working in Wyoming. And I just thought it would give me a more well-rounded background of the state that I truly loved. And in that process, I met some of the most amazing people. In fact, I think every Leadership Wyoming class would say they're all amazing, right?
Absolutely.
And so you build those relationships. And so we're nearing the end of our class modules, and we're headed to Casper for our last meeting. And some of my friends had heard that there was a seat opening up in House District 51. So they said, Rosie, you need to run for that seat. And they passed around a hat and collected monies for that. Well, in that class, we had legislator, and we had lobbyists, and we had state agencies, of course, and all the other wonderful people that made up the class. And so they cheered me on. Mm-hmm. And of course, I had just been approached about it, so I hadn't even made any decisions. But with their guidance and their encouragement, I really considered it seriously. And so running the race, winning, what I was telling the class yesterday as we were speaking about legislative process is that you run a campaign and then you have to transition to governance. And what was really important to me was the trust that we had built up and the respect that we built up with our class. And when I walked in for my first day in the legislature in January of 2003, some of my classmates were all standing on the steps in the rotunda to welcome me and to really guide me through the process. But
I got goosebumps thinking about that.
And those relationships are still intact today, which I'm very proud of. To think that it's 19 years later, we are still friends, we still work together, and we were willing, even if we were on different sides of a piece of legislation, which was my first go around with some of my friends. They taught me so much about the process. I trusted them. And I also knew and valued their relationships. And I think that that's what, as I've been able to be reintroduced back into Leadership Wyoming, I'm seeing that value. And I'm very hopeful for the next generation of leaders.
Well, Rosie, speaking of the current class, you are now serving as a Leadership Wyoming facilitator and helping the current class walk through their experience here in Cheyenne. We've described you as a safari guide at times, to pointing out what they're observing, what they're seeing. And they've also noticed that you can't walk more than about 10 feet through probably any building in Cheyenne, but particularly the Capitol, without seeing the connections that you have and how instrumental you were in helping with this restoration project. So talk a little bit about what it's like to be back in the Capitol, not in your representative hat, but in this other hat of guiding others through the experience and showcasing all the work you put in.
Right. Well, and I think what most people have learned already is how much I love this Capitol, how much I respect the legislative institution, and how important it is for us to uphold this institution with civility, with respect, and do the people's work. And the educating people that this is their house, this is their government, and how important it was to do this restoration. We do not have another building in the state of Wyoming that is of this caliber. It is, in my view, the jewel, and it was critical that we do this work. And of course, this is our first session back, and I'm thrilled to be here. It's truly like coming home for me. And yes, and in order for a change to occur, for us to be able to invest in this building, you have to continually work on building relationships. And there are a lot of moving parts, not only in the legislative branch, but also in the executive branch. And certainly this now, with the Supreme Court being able to actually hold their meetings here, to have court here, we have the 3 branches of government represented in this building. And that was a long process with our committee to make certain that when we came back to the Capitol, that we had all 5 statewide electeds represented or working in this building. Now, a lot of people have a misconception of how we spent so much money, in their view, about the restoration, but you see, it had to do with the campus, and it was about really bringing the Capitol back into a neighborhood, and with that, the Hirschler building and the state office buildings there. So now we have a very modern building that was very deteriorated. I think many people either forget or didn't realize that, in the 1980s, we really didn't have much money in Wyoming. And so we built the Hirschler building at the end of the 79 to 81, and there was no maintenance ever done on it.
Wow.
So it was deteriorating terribly. The Capitol had never been renovated. We added and changed things within the Capitol, but we covered up its bones, its infrastructure. And so it was deteriorating, and it was really the highest priority for us. And really that's what we do as policymakers, as your representative. We are here first to protect the citizens of Wyoming on health and safety, right? And that was not happening here at the Capitol.
Sure.
It was less than 5 minutes that we would have to evacuate this building, right? Well, it's not possible to survive that, really. And many of our new class, 2020, has been hearing about this, but we only had one entrance really, that was doable for disability, ADA accessibility, right? We had one elevator on each side of the Capitol, and most of the time they didn't work and we were stuck in them, right? So now we've had to change that.
That's one way to, come to agreement on a bill, if everyone who's working on it is stuck in the elevator.
Absolutely.
Maybe we need to bring back that functionality.
Or maybe design it within the new elevators,
there's a separate
right?
button.
Well, right now, maybe we're having some efficiency with these bills, whether they live or die, just based on people getting lost.
Sure.
Because they still don't know where to go.
Yeah.
And we've made it more complex and better, but it's complex with all of our new meeting rooms. And so, in doing this, I don't highly recommend doing a renovation by committee.
Sure.
And so that became a very tedious process. And when I walk around now in this Capitol, and really, I was over earlier this morning in the Hirschler building looking, and I participated in picking out all the carpets. But it isn't about just picking out a carpet sample. We were picking out the threads that would be weaved together to make the carpet, right? All the colors of the walls, and what the furniture would look like. Although we don't have furniture in a lot of the areas yet, we will. But then one of the other bonuses that I think people will realize as they start using their Capitol again more is that we've added the extension, which for people who had walked through these halls over the last 40 years would know that it was a tunnel. And really when that was structured is we had tunnels underground that actually have access to all the other buildings that are on the Capitol campus, right? And so they became hazardous to all of us, and they were closed off. But those in the original design were a part of what convenient ways to move about underground to these different buildings. So we were able then to push out the tunnel, remove all the mold in it, and all the flooding and all of the problems that we had. And now we have these very modern, with technology, and places for people to sit. Several of the rooms are for 75, a couple of the rooms for 150. We now have a learning center that we will create because, that's one of my passionate areas is civic education and making certain that when our young people come in to their Capitol, they understand about their legislature and their government. And we'll now have a student learning center. We also have an auditorium for more than 300 people. So our push was really about public participation, public access, and transparency.
It's so beautiful too. It's just so fun to walk around. One of the most common phrases that I've heard as we refer to walking in your wake is, Rosie, we really miss you here. And I know they mean we miss you as a friend, but I also know that they mean we miss the presence you brought and the gracious space that we now teach in Leadership Wyoming that you brought to the legislature. So talk a little bit about your approach in a leadership position and on different committees what was the presence you brought that perhaps is missed now?
I think, leadership is very important, and your action in many ways speaks louder than your words. And that was one of my goals. It didn't start out that way. As the first session, it took a couple of sessions, but as I started to move into a leadership role, I loved this institution and this building, and I realized how honored I was to be serving the people. And I wanted my peers to be empowered, to be the best that they could be. And for my own personal growth, of course, I'd been through Leadership Wyoming, so I knew how important that role was, but started a program. First off, I started the Wyoming Women's Legislative Caucus, and that intent was that we were fewer in number, and I wanted to make certain that when we stood up at the podium, or we were presenting a bill, or we were working with our constituency, that we truly were being the best that we could be, that we had the right speaking skills, that we actually understood the legislative process. And so in that process of developing a program for women, it then started to encompass our chairmans, because I wanted to make certain that they knew how to run a meeting. Because when I received my first chairmanship, I was like, oh wow, now what do I do? But you have a lot of moving pieces that you need to address. And most important is you want your public to be really comfortable. But then what a lot of people don't quite realize is that you have agencies testifying before you on legislation that we're proposing that is going to impact them, right? And at the end of the day, it's going to impact the citizens of Wyoming. So you want that expertise. Well, I saw somewhat of an erosion of a level of comfort. People, it seemed to me that there was a fear to present to their legislative body, to a chairman. And I thought, well, that's not going to help us find solutions. So without having read Pat Yu's book on gracious space, I decided that when I became a chairman, that that was going to be my first goal, that we were going to make certain that people were comfortable in my space, in our space, their space. And so I started that by making certain that I was out in the halls before my meetings, that I was meeting and greeting. I would even hold a meeting. I would try to know, plan my agenda in advance so people had time to be prepared. And then I would make certain that they knew who I was and that we would have a relationship, so that instead of them telling me what they thought I would want to know, that they would be comfortable in telling me what we needed to know in order to find a solution, so that their
powerful
agency would operate better. Well, I think what happens in that is you continue over the years to build those relationships, and I think that's what the fun part is that for almost 16 years I was a part of this institution, and many of these people are still here, and I was also helping train up the next group of people that are leaders, lobbyists, legislative service staff. We have a temporary staff during the legislative session to augment the services that are needed for 90 people coming in. It's people don't realize, we're here for 20 days during the budget session, 40 for the general, and we rarely meet at the Capitol during the interim. So we're moving across the state of Wyoming. So again, I got involved there, making certain to accommodate the meetings in other communities, because it was sort of that idea of bringing your legislature to your town, so that you could do that. So that was one part of it. And then just certainly the whole process of being chairman of appropriations, you kind of get to know everybody around the state of Wyoming.
It's a big seat to fill.
It's a big seat to fill. There's really, in that time process, you meet the mayors of communities, city council, county commissioners. It just is phenomenal. You have, later today we're going over to the Supreme Court. So what's interesting is the Supreme Court, who manages the oversight of all courts in Wyoming, right? They have to come and present a budget, and they have to tell us about, Chief Justice Davis just spoke about this, about how they really need additional funding now for technology advancements within the judicial system, because our society is changing and those demands and needs are changing, and those cost dollars. And so you have to figure out how to build relationships with people to know that this is authentic, and this is really needed. And so you learn a lot about all the different services that are provided for the citizens of Wyoming. And I think that because I treated the people with respect, whether I agreed with them or disagreed with them, I wanted to share with them this process so that we could find good resolution to today's problems.
Well, we've heard a lot in the last couple of days about the increase in the pace of decisions and the complexity of decisions. And relationships play such a role as those things increase in what can get done and how it gets done. What do you think are the skills that are needed as this class sort of maybe considers a future run for the legislature or another statewide office? What do you think is becoming increasingly important with that sort of quickened pace and or increased complexity?
Well, preparation is very important. And what I would advise over the years with constituency and agency heads, really anyone that wanted to run for office, but advocacy groups are a critical part of how we maneuver the system and make good decisions, right? Because truly, as a policymaker, I didn't sit in a corner and try to come up with a bill for the session. Those needs and ideas, or I call them tweaks, affixed to existing statute, it came from my citizens, my constituencies, and it wasn't just about Sheridan County. It became about statewide. So I think that that's a really important component, is that you cannot just have a local perspective about the job ahead of you. I think it's important that you're building those relationships, that you are preparing yourself, that you become an expert in a certain area. You know, we have 90 people, and they are all walks of life, right? And it's really important that we initially do not get to choose which committee we sit on. A funny story is that I was in the travel industry and did a lot with tourism and also small business owner. And so I requested that I be on the minerals committee or that I be on corporations. I thought, this is where my expertise is. I ended up on the judiciary committee, which I didn't know anything about. So you want those diverse backgrounds. And it was such a phenomenal learning ground for me. And so you have to be adaptable. You have to be objective. You have to be willing, as we learn those 4 components with Gracious Space, about the spirit. So I think, you know, that's what I carried, a very enthusiastic, welcoming, come into our house, come in and experience your government. And, you know, when I did the leap into leadership, I realized the fear that people had speaking to their representative. And I was like, well, that's your friend or your neighbor. I mean, how did you elect that person? What was the criteria, their character? What was the reason that you chose that person in the ballot box to be your representative? So what makes it different now that they're in Cheyenne? So it was really fun. The first leap into leadership was during what we would call pretty much nonprofit week, and it was bookends with the Wyoming Governor's Arts Awards event. So it brought in people, again, from all over the state, and what I loved about that was teaching them networking, how important it was to reach out.
Are you good at networking, Rosie?
You know,
like a superpower.
it's the connectivity, and it's what works. And so it's not about, I guess I felt like it's not going to do anyone good in the future for me to hoard the knowledge, hoard the information. I need to share it. And if I can just give you little bits of it, and I can give you another person that can maybe further you in that development of a good project, then I've done my job. You know, people say, why did you do this? And I think, well, you know, the canned answer for most people, because it's true, is we want to make a difference. You know, but only people can make a difference. People can only make the change in the culture. And that's what I was doing subtly with the fact that they were like, oh, it's okay to go to appropriations because Rosie's chairing. And, you know, and I've worked with her and we've had a meeting and we're making progress on this. So that would be another area. And I think another component of Gracious Space is invite the stranger. You know, I realized when doing recalibration or speaking about education, that we didn't have the student in the chair. We didn't have a teacher in the chair. We had advocates, we had school board members, or we had superintendents, but we didn't have the people that were in the trenches. We didn't have the people that were being affected by our decisions. Truly, what were our needs? And a fun part of that was that helped me, I think, become a better legislator, was that I didn't go to college to be in political science, right? So that wasn't my background. And I had to learn a lot about the history of Wyoming, the legislative process, by going to other trainings, by being a part of this, by doing a lot of reading. And education also I lacked in the real K through 12 experience because I didn't have children. You know, I pay taxes in my community, right? But I would certainly celebrate my other friends' children, but I wasn't
as close.
I wasn't as close.
Yeah.
I wasn't in the classroom.
Sure.
I wasn't cheering on someone at the football field or saying that we needed a new athletic center or we needed this. And so one of the really good programs that we enhanced while I was in the legislature was called Back to School with Legislators. And so it was a civic education program. Now, I think it was supposed to be for the children, K through 12, but in the end, I think it was for us as policymakers. It was some of the funnest times, and it really taught me to be a better person. And what I realized about that is that the children then would go home and talk about their representative.
And civic engagement.
Yeah. And to their parents. And my favorite story of being in a fourth grade class in Bighorn, Wyoming, was a young boy standing up and say to me, "So, do you drive a Chevy or a Ford?" And I thought, wow, isn't that awesome?
Yeah.
You know, so that to me is.
What was the answer?
And well, I drove a Chevy.
Yeah. Was that suitable to him?
It worked.
Yeah.
It
Good.
did work.
Good.
Yes.
Good.
Yeah.
You passed the test.
I passed the test, and so, you know, I'm hoping that today, in fact, that class, one of the young men is now my neighbor, and he remembered me
Really?
from my class
It's
participation.
a beautiful part of Wyoming.
And it really is the beautiful part. And so I think that is another reason that we do it. I also think that the setting is important, and that is truly, if we come back to just sitting in this room this morning, this is the people's house, and it shouldn't be in a shambles state. It should be accessible. They should feel really proud when they walk up those steps. And that was part of my memory from my first day, was walking up those steps and realizing this is my capital and this is my place. And I'm excited to see, you know, we still have quite a bit of work left to do to really make it comfortable and livable here, which I think will happen in this next year. But to see the legislators, you know, we have 2/3 of our House had never sat in the House chambers. And they are just thrilled. Now, my hope is that as we move further through this process, that we will see a resurgence of civil discourse in these chambers, because I think they call for respect. And that's a part.
I get goosebumps again.
Well, I mean, that's what it's about. I think that was, somebody brought this up the other day when I encountered them. Is about decorum. I was fair, and I was objective to all sides of legislation. And people will talk about the difficulties of maybe trying to be bipartisan. And, you know, honestly, with our minority party, that's not hard to manage. What you can't do is forget about them being a supermajority. And that was really a very important part for me. I think you've seen that, all sides of the aisle, my relationships with them, because they were elected, and they have a voice, and we need to work together again to find the best solutions. And so one of my priorities was making certain, because this doesn't happen across the nation, that if you're in a minority party, you do not get your legislation heard. And I felt that it was very important. They were working just as hard as me to have that opportunity, and at least it should be introduced. Their legislation should be introduced. And then, you know, it needs to stand on its own. It gets directed to a committee. It has hearings. And as we talked about this the other day, there's probably up to 27 steps for a bill to live or die. And of course, it can end on step 1. But the fact is,
or step 26.
or step 26, right? It can be vetoed. There's so many ways, the life of a bill and what you have to go through. And so that's why you also, a legislator, has to work with lobbyists, has to work with advocates, has to work with its citizens, has to know the other chamber. You know, if you're a representative, you need to start walking down the hall and getting to know your senators. You need to also share in, well, you know, two words that I used a lot through my time was consensus building, collaboration. Not diminishing your values or sacrificing anything, or actually even developing a bill that is ineffective. But it was finding that common ground. And if you could work a bill to get 80% of what you started out with, you had a really good chance of making that work and be effective. Also patience. Patience is another hard character for us to really hone in on, right? And
Yes.
you know, I had several major pieces of legislation that actually, if you look in the statutes, you won't see Berger by it. Started out that way. If you go back to the original bills, you'll find that. But they became important pieces of legislation that generated conversation and town hall meetings and went to a standing committee and created then a good piece of legislation that still stands today. And in fact, one piece of legislation is just having an amendment to it. And that was, I started that in 2003. It passed in 2006. So it's been able to hold its own for 13 years. And it would be natural that through changes in our society and industry and needs, that there would be some adjustment that we need to make. It doesn't sound like it right now because I'm doing all the talking, but listening is a really important skill. Making certain that the person that you're having a meeting with, or if you're having a committee meeting, that they know that their voice is being heard, because it may be their only chance to express their expertise or their concern or their support.
Well, it was interesting hearing you and Kermit Brown talk yesterday and hearing Kermit talk about statesmanship, that we are in a challenging place in our Wyoming, economy and our government system and government revenue, and that really it will require statesmanship to work our way out of this challenge. And maybe speak a little bit about what that means to you, or, I think that you represent many of those qualities, and you've talked about many of them here today, but sort of forward-looking, what do you think it will be required of this body to do the work that's ahead?
Yeah, it's going to take courage. You're going to need to be brave. I think one thing I can share with everyone is that I made a decision right from the get-go that I would want to learn everything I could about an issue. I would not commit either way. It's interesting. Sometimes I would know when I read a bill that I thought, this is what I think, and this is how I'm going to vote. And then I would go into committee meeting, and I would then have both sides of the story, basically, right? And work the bill and do all of that. And sometimes it was very, very clear what I needed to do. But there were many times that was sleepless nights of trying to make the decision of what does my constituency really want. And this is what's going to have to happen for us to really move the dial. One of the biggest issues, and I certainly don't have the answers to this, but is how do we generate revenue in this state? Because we've all now experienced, we've gone through booms and busts, but we always were able to bring back our natural resources. The demand was there, not only on a national basis, but on a global basis. But now we have a change in the alternatives to what our natural resources are, correct? And how we can add value to that. But it isn't going to be the same as when you pull coal out, when you extract coal out of the ground. And we don't have that revenue source at this moment. It's declined greatly. And it doesn't matter how many, we had that discussion yesterday with Kermit and Tim Stubson, is that we can bring in many companies, but they're not going to make up the difference of our mineral royalties and our severance taxes in the way that coal did, or natural gas, right? And even oil. And that, of course, we've seen that go up and down too. So it's, it's interesting. We never depended on oil as a constant. It was coal that was our constant. So it did not happen over time, and our solutions are not going to come quickly either. I mean, I should say it did happen over a long period of time, and finding a solution is not going to happen over time. But we cannot put our heads in the sand. And this is an opportunity truly for us as leaders across Wyoming, and I'm thinking about this as we have more than 800 Leadership Wyoming graduates, is to start reaching out and really engaging in this committee work. And even if there's not a committee, why not get a hold of your legislators? Why not get a hold of the executive branch? Why not work with folks from the university? We've invested greatly in looking at research and development and adding value to our natural resources, and making certain that we preserve our open spaces and make certain that we have the quality of life that many of us have experienced, and that we'll have that for future generations. But again, it still takes money, right? It still takes revenue. And so the governor, Governor Gordon and his team certainly have challenges. This legislature has challenges, and now you see the one of the big challenges too is the change in representation. So we have 2020 is a campaign season, and we'll have many changes, and we'll have people that don't know this institution. They may only know one issue, and they have a high learning curve, and so we have to figure out a way to make certain that we help nurture them along and make these decisions. And we as citizens need to be open to having these conversations, that there isn't a right or a wrong. Let's hold off on that. Let's hold off on, is this good or bad? Let's do research. Let's have meetings. Let's say, am I willing to give this up in order to have this? And to make certain that future generations have a way to have a government that will serve them well. And we can just not deplete our what we call our rainy day account. We were wise, and it was 90 people plus the executive branch, great leadership across the state of Wyoming in saving and starting savings accounts in different ways, that people complain sometimes and say, well, I don't know where all the money is. But we can make a list of several areas that we are all benefiting from. And we did that when we had good times, and thank goodness we did. People thought that as we were appropriating, we were actually spending the money, but it was being saved. And now we have those reserves, and I think that's another area, because going back to one of your original questions about how fast we move, I agree with that. And we do not want to panic, because we don't need to panic, but we need to be vigilant about the future and moving forward with ideas and how we make changes. And right now, I think I've been hearing this a lot as I've been seeing all these folks in the chambers and out in the halls, and that is that we put kind of a false facade on it has to happen today. We got to get this done right away. And so in my view, that can create poor legislation. And then we're stuck with those consequences. And then it takes us another it takes almost a year in a lot of ways to put rules and regulations in place and to make things change and happen and be the law and the process. So then you have to start again over, right? And adjusting. And we need to invest in our economy, as far as looking at ways to enhance it. I mean, what are the right programs? We've been traveling the state, entrepreneurship, how do we support that? How do we create a skilled workforce? How do we create a community that you want to live in?
But they're all connected, and so it's this systems thinking of, we can't just wipe the system out and build a new one. It is incremental changes here and there and levers to pull that influence other pieces and different metrics. And so, yeah, I I often sort of push back on people who say like, oh, they don't know what they're doing down in Cheyenne. And it's like, well, would you know what you're doing, or do you understand the entire system that, and I think we had a class member yesterday describe it as, writing rules for the game, and that's what they're doing, and we're asking them to write the best rules under the conditions that exist today and with the future in mind.
That is absolutely correct, and they're trying to do that for a 2-year budget in 24 days this year, right? So one of the things that we can do as citizens and as Leadership Wyoming graduates is we can reach out to our policymakers. We can meet with people in the interim and help them with these issues, and not take an adversarial role or this is the way it needs to be done. But let's put together more of these brainstorming meetings and feel comfortable about it. In fact, using the Leadership Wyoming model in a way where we have a safe environment to have discussions, and that we continue to carry that respect for one another. I mean, it's the fun thing. Really, Leadership Wyoming classes have a sort of what I call the perfect model of what I think Washington, D.C. used to be like, right? You could be of opposite parties from the East Coast to the West Coast, and different views, and come together, and you worked on this. You had debate, you worked in committees, but then you were at a picnic with family, and a dinner or various things like that, where you actually were friends. And if you talk to any of, well, you've all been witnessing it, my peers, the people that I served with, and even new people that I've helped along the way, when they see us together like that, they go, wow, you have a relationship. That takes work, right? And we need to get back to that. And I think that that's what happened is Leadership Wyoming alum have that experience, and they know how to do it, because I've been hearing conversations where people are on different sides of an issue, right?
It's been fun to watch.
It's really fun to watch.
Yeah.
But they care very much about that relationship.
They do it respectfully.
Respectfully.
Yeah.
And so, that whole aspect of learning in public, that is what the Wyoming Legislature is. That is truly learning in public. And you are truly in a fishbowl, because you've heard that before, right? And you are swimming as hard as you possibly can to find the right answers to fix something. Because at the end of the day, all 90 representatives and senators signed up because they believe in Wyoming. And that is their common thread. They love Wyoming and her people, and they want to serve.
Yeah. Aw, that's awesome, Rosie.
Yeah.
So last question that we'll end on and get back out to the people's work here in the Capitol. What advice would you give to the version of Rosie Berger who graduated from Leadership Wyoming in 2002? Or what would you sort of, looking back on who you were then and who you are now, what would you say, hold on to or get ready, or kind of what would your advice be to that person almost 20 years ago?
I think when you graduate from Leadership Wyoming, you are empowered. You are empowered by the spirit of Wyoming, of her people, truly. You realize how different we can all be on the outside, but our inward spirit is so great, and that it eliminates for me fear. I would say that take a risk, and I have said this over the last couple of years, just jump in and show up. You have to be passionate. I didn't sign up for Leadership Wyoming just to have another meeting, right? I signed up because I cared about Wyoming, and I wanted to make a difference. And I wasn't certain how that would look, I did not know until I was graduating from the program that I would run a campaign, and I did not know how to do that. I knew nothing about politics in that respect. I had never worked on anyone's campaign. I had never done any of those things. And so it was a whole new learning experience, but Leadership Wyoming encourages that.
It's kind of a springboard.
It is a
Yeah.
springboard. I mean, that's one of our tenets is,
Yeah.
first you have to know yourself, right? And this is what you do. And you become vulnerable, right? You're like, and honestly, I bet everyone out there listening is going to, I hope, agree with me, but there's sometimes I don't really like this part of the module.
Yeah.
I don't really want to be here
I don't want to
today.
be that honest.
I don't want to be that honest. I don't really want to write on this part of it. But you realize that you're learning about yourself, you're learning to work with others, and you realize I am doing this because I do believe in the future of Wyoming, and I can in some capacity. And it just happened that I ended up in a place, the stars aligned, and I had the opportunity to represent the people for 14 years. But there are other ways to be a leader. And I think that I've been seeing that now in the last couple of years being involved with Leadership Wyoming, is that you can do that at the very basic level of taking care of your family. If you're running a bank, if you're running a nonprofit, if you're a teacher. I mean, I have seen some real benefits for these individuals. And also another way that we as Leadership Wyoming can carry on for future generations is mentoring. Let's open ourselves up to being available. And I think that is one of the reasons that I have so many other relationships within the Capitol, is because I help them maneuver the system. Because it is a game. It's not one that I would have apply my skills to, but it was like, I need to know all the rules of the road. So once I learn the rules of the road, I want to help you know what they are, because then together we can be more effective.
And do more.
Yeah, and so I would just use my 2 words: jump in.
Jump in. Awesome. Wow.
Yeah.
Rosie, thanks for being with us. And great to hear your stories and continue. So thanks for joining us for Leading in Wyoming. We'll be back with some additional episodes soon. The Leading Wyoming podcast is possible thanks to the generous support of the Wyoming Dragisevich Foundation and the Wyoming Community Foundation.